Hi, everyone. Happy rainy Monday, and welcome to today's In Search of Civility. My name is Kathy Grismeyer, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with my wonderful co-host, Kelly Packer. Before we introduce our guests, let me share a little bit of background about our podcast, In Search of Civility. This series is an innovative partnership between the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber. We started this series in January 2021 and remain committed to discussing the challenges facing our state and our local communities. In Search of Civility believes in the idea that truth exists and cannot be found without a sincere exchange of ideas. Civility in our discourse, we believe, is necessary for advancement and preservation of relationships, institutions, and society. To agree, one must first disagree well. Listening actively to key stakeholders, giving your political opponents respect, the benefit of the doubt, empathy, and sympathy for their motives. Ultimately, civility gives us the opportunity for our own ideas and notions to change, bringing improvements to our own lives and even society as a whole. We believe civil dialogue can affect great change, which is why we strive to help important conversations take place here in Idaho. These conversations, of course, are not possible, however, without the help of our partners. We especially want to thank Holly Troxel Law Firm for sponsoring our show and have a short video to play for our listeners to learn more about their work here in Boise.
We date our roots back to the 1860s with James Hawley. Although we have a long history, we've also done well to adapt to the future and adapt to what it means to provide legal services today in what is often a high-tech world.
When you have 110 lawyers under one roof practicing together, they help each other out. It's a great value to the client.
The values we're presenting to our clients and to each other, and the way we're conducting ourselves both professionally and personally, makes it a natural fit that we're going to do our best to serve the members of our community.
We also want to thank our media partners, Idaho Education News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and the Idaho Capital Sun. They provide us with a platform and an audience with whom we can interact. And joining us today are four special guests who work within the liquor and restaurant industry, as well as its governing policies here in Idaho. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly now, who will tell us a little bit more about our guest today.
Thank you, Kathy. We have an exciting panel today of industry and policy experts. So let's get our introductions started. Our first guest is Senator Jim Guthrie. Senator Jim Guthrie represents District 28 in the Idaho Legislature, which includes all of Power and Franklin counties and part of Bannock County, where he also serves as the chair of the Senate State Affairs Committee. He previously served one term in the House of Representatives from 2010 to 2012 and has been in the Senate since then. He was born in Pocatello, Idaho, and is a graduate of Marsh Valley High School. He was a member of the Marsh Valley School District Board of Trustees from 1995 to 2001, as well as a Bannock County Commissioner from 2001 to 2007. He's a rancher and a business owner, father of 3 children, and proud grandparent to 9 grandchildren. Welcome, Senator Guthrie. Thank you for being here. Our second guest is Dave Krick. Dave Krick is a partner at JEL Restaurants, a group that includes Bitter Creek Ale House, Red Feather Lounge, Diablo and Sons Saloon, and Woodland Brewery and Tap Room. Along with the restaurant businesses, Dave serves on several nonprofit boards, including the Boise Farmers Market, City of Good, and Fair Idaho. Welcome, Dave. We're glad you joined us today. Our third guest, Jeremy Pisca, is a partner at Risch, Pisca Law and Policy, where he practices as both an attorney and a lobbyist while concentrating his practice in the area of government affairs. Jeremy has been involved in Idaho politics for more than 25 years, and he has represented clients in virtually all issue areas, including tax policy, economic development, e-commerce, product regulation, professional licensure and regulation, natural resource development, use and regulation, healthcare, finance and appropriations, administrative procedure, real estate and development, telecommunications, transportation, and education, finance, regulation, and administration. In addition to representing many clients in other industries, he also serves as the executive director of the Idaho Beer and Wine Distributors Association. Thank you for joining us, Jeremy. Our fourth and final guest is Kevin Settles. Kevin is the co-founder of Bardenay Restaurants and Distilleries, with the specific responsibility for permitting the distillery and setting up the bar. In 2001, he bought out his fellow partners and has been responsible for all operations, including the addition of 2 new locations in Eagle and Coeur d'Alene. In March of 2020, the company opened Coignes, I probably said that wrong, Kevin, you'll have to correct me, restaurant and bar, also located in Eagle, Idaho. In October of 2021, Kevin and his wife, Elizabeth Fraser, sold their interest in the company to the Bardenay Inc. Retirement Plan Trust, but Kevin retained his position as president and CEO. Kevin is an emeritus member of the National Restaurant Association and its Education Foundation and Board of Directors. He is the past president of the Idaho Lodging and Restaurant Association and is still a member of its board, in addition to serving as a commissioner for the Idaho Human Rights Commission and as treasurer for the Idaho Health Insurance Exchange, Your Health Idaho. Welcome, Kevin. We're glad you could join us today.
Thank you. And it's coins, just like the round coin. It's a family name.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for those introductions, Kelly. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. And I know that this topic has been sort of evolving over many, many years. And so to help kind of set the stage for our listeners, again, knowing that it's been a complicated issue for a number of years, I think what we'd like to do to start with is asking each of our participants today to help our listeners better understand what was the previous state of Idaho's liquor laws. That's pre-session 2023. How were they established? Who do they benefit? And what changes were stakeholders asking for? So why don't we start in the reverse order of how we did introductions? Kevin, do you want to start first? And then we'll work our way back to Jeremy, then to Dave, and then end with you, Senator Guthrie.
Ooh, thanks, I guess. I would rather have let some other people go first on this one, just because there's a lot of history within the group. I think, I got involved in the restaurant business in 1999, and that was when I learned about buying a liquor license we went to a broker, I guess. Actually, it was Dave Krick was my partner back then, and his family found this. Subsequently to that, I've added 3 locations, currently own 4 liquor licenses, or actually, I no longer own them. The trust does, and that will factor into my conversation later on today. All of those licenses were purchased from developers who knew they wanted to have restaurant tenants, and so they had managed to acquire those licenses, over my years of involvement. And I've taken a lot of runs at trying to change pass legislation. So actually, Dave and I passed a bill in '99 that allowed a distiller to own a liquor by the drink license in the state. And since then, I think Senator Guthrie's bill was the first one to pass since then of any significance. So, watching it, participating over the years, we went through, there's always been a lot of gray area, and the state patrol has had a lot of alcohol beverage control, has had a fair amount of discretion in how they interpret the way that they should deal with licenses. And of course, business people being business people, they're always trying to figure out how to poke a hole in it and get to the point where they can do what they want to do. So these have revolved around ability to buy a license, ability to lease a license. When I first got in the business, you could actually buy a license and stick it in your drawer and not have to use it. They eliminated the ability to do that. You had to put it in play. Now, since then, at one point in time, I had a friend who came up on the list with a new license, put a bar in his hotel room that was open the minimum number of hours until it was seasoned, and then sold that. So over the years, we've had a lot of ingenious ways, I think, to try and leverage this privilege we get from the state for $600 and can sell later for up to $300,000 and higher. So it's been, the state ABC has continually tried to make it more difficult, I think, for people to rig the system. And but it still caused a lot of frustration, and it brought a lot of people that would own licenses that had nothing to do with the business, which I was never a fan of. I think that's the problem that the bill last year fixed, but it still creates a lot of unknowns in how it applies going forward. And I probably will address the experience I went through in transferring the liquor licenses from Bardenay, the ownership of Bardenay Inc., and how it interacted with our liquor licenses, because it really kind of applies to this legislation. And the gray areas that have now gotten a little grayer.
Thank you, Kevin,
I'll leave
and
it at that.
for being a good sport, for letting me put you on the spot and having you go first. Jeremy, do you want to jump in and speak from your perspective and your client's perspective, kind of the background and what we're seeing moving forward?
Absolutely. Happy to do that. So recognize that most all of the liquor and alcohol administration laws are a direct result of the repeal of prohibition 100 years ago. Argue what you will, whether that's good or bad, but you have all of the power to regulate alcohol is reserved to the states. And so that's why you'll see largely 50 different systems of alcohol administration throughout the United States. Each state is supposed to customize it in a way that best reflects their local values. What Idaho chose to do, and a number of other states did as well, was to regulate the density of liquor, one, by putting it through a state liquor dispensary, so the state owns the liquor stores, but secondly, to regulate the density of retail liquor licenses, and they do that by a system that's called the quota system. So what the quota system does is it says that every incorporated city in the state of Idaho gets 2 liquor licenses. They get 1 additional liquor license for every 1,500 residents. So in that way, as your population increases, so too do the amount of, or the density of liquor outlets in your city. That system led to a couple of different problems. One is it created a supply and demand problem. If you had a liquor license, it was worth a lot. If you didn't have a liquor license, there was a limited supply, so there were a couple of ways you could go about getting one. You could put your name on a waiting list and wait for your city's population to increase. The next person on the list pays the fee, gets the license. The second way is to buy it on the open market from somebody who had already received a liquor license from that priority list. And in some cases, it really depends on where you are in the state of Idaho, but I've heard of those licenses selling for as high as $500,000, but averaging somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000. Again, to Mr. Suttle's point, these are licenses that were obtained by the state for $600. So they became quite an investment. The third way you could get a liquor license was you could go to the Idaho State Legislature and pass a special exception. And there are a number of different exceptions in Idaho law that allow ski resorts, airports, train cars, different types of arenas. It gives them the ability to go get a liquor license without having to wait on that priority list. What the legislation did this past session was essentially say that any new license issued after July 1 can't be transferred. If you get on the list and you get a license and your business fails, it simply goes right back into the pool for the next person on the list. It also created some restrictions on how existing license holders prior to July 1 could transfer those. And I think that'll probably be the topic of much of the discussion today. So with that, I'll answer questions, but hand it over to whoever's next.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Dave, if you want to jump up and add from your perspective, kind of the lay of the land.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin and Jeremy have done a nice job giving the background and the history. You know, I personally have been in and out of this subject for years. I would say that probably both of them are more experienced than me. I'm not in it as much as they are, but you know, I think the things that I could add to it, Title 23 is complicated, and it's complicated for 2 reasons. One, I mean, the business of alcohol needs to be done responsibly. We care about underage drinking and overconsumption. And so as we change rules, we have to make sure that those things are considered. And the existing regulatory ecosystem, it impacts people's lives. Those that have invested in the current system have a lot at stake. And so I think that they care deeply about those changes. Historically, I mean, we every year there's tinkering within Title 23, and there's definitely changes every year from a few to quite a few. But where we struggle is that we have two opposing forces, one that wants sweeping changes and one that wants no change. And I think that we run into problems when forces try to make sweeping change run into forces that want absolutely no change, especially as we talk about something like the quota system. And I think where we might find more success in our organization, FAIR, has specifically focused on how do we find win-win solutions? How do we find ways that we don't harm people and we find maybe a center lane that isn't as sweeping as some people want, but also does allow the system to evolve in a healthy way.
Great, thank you. And Senator Guthrie, if you want to jump in and add any final comments, maybe with a legislative perspective around how the legislature's viewed this issue historically.
Yeah, and first off, I'd like to also thank Holly Troxel for sponsoring something like this, and it's a way to get information out to folks. So thank you to that, and then also Kelly and Kathy for your role in wanting to get more information out on sensitive topics, and also the Chamber and the Association of Cities as well. And I appreciate the the intent behind civility, because that is really. We can disagree and still be respectful about it. So I think that's a good premise on which to debate and to, share our views on different topics. When you look at the historical nature of this issue, you can go back to Butch Otter, Governor Otter, Bill Roden, Senator Jim Rice worked on it, Senator Lodge worked on it, and many others over the years. And why did that happen? And it's because there was a sense that something maybe wasn't quite right with the system we had. At least I think that's enough of the opinion of enough people that's what's prompted some activity in this regard. And to Jeremy's point about the quota system, and you say, well, why did that happen? Just to put a little finer point on that, the Constitution expresses a desire for the people of the state of Idaho to have temperance. And so that promotes this idea that will limit the number of these outlets, so to speak, that can sell liquor by the drink. Kind of the problem with that is that on the heels of that, because that one size fits all hasn't fit all, that has caused the proliferation of specialty licenses to try to fit different situations. And so that's been a challenge to try to find the right mix. You can look at all kinds of things like resort cities that have been big influxes of people, and those kind of things, and how do you best meet the needs of tourists and those kind of situations. One of the things that has really driven the need for change too is when you look at the current law, it was never intended to be a property right. And when you've got something that you can purchase for $600 or $700 and sell them for $300,000 or $400,000, it starts to look like a duck. And so I think that mandate in legislation that it's not intended to be a property right has driven part of this desire to kind of temper this speculative nature of things that's happened. And let's face it, people 20, 30 years ago or whatever have went, and the stories are anecdotal, but I've heard people say it, for the truth, that people went all over the state and put their names on lists so that when those names come up, then it's kind of akin to hitting a lottery ticket a little bit, or it can be. So that's just a little bit of brief history. Look forward to your questions, and thank you for having us.
Thank you. That was great. As you can see, for our audience, this is a vast topic. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of history, and to some of the points that were made, there's definitely some diverging opinions on what it should look like and how it should operate. I think that a few of the issues were touched on, including resort cities. I was glad that Senator Guthrie brought that up, because as Jeremy mentioned, there's 2 per city, and the only way to get additional is if you have an increase of at least 1,500 people every so often in growth. Well, some of those smaller cities, resort cities, don't grow as far as residential size, but boy, they sure have thousands and thousands of people that come in their seasonal peaks and can't, take care of and or manage that increase of their population, because they don't see a resulting increase in liquor licenses. So really great that you brought that up. Because this is so vast, we're obviously not going to get to everything, but what I'd like to touch on now is what changes actually occurred during this 2023 session. It was mentioned a little bit by Jeremy, but what were the changes and how's that playing out? What are the pros and cons to that? And how are stakeholders feeling about this new landscape? Not so much necessarily what are some of the things that need to happen, because I think that's going to be our next question moving down the road, but what did happen and how are we feeling about those changes right now? I'm going to keep the same kind of rotation, but we're going to start with Senator Guthrie and go from him to Dave, to Jeremy, to Kevin this time.
I can see right off that being kind of in the middle was the place to be today. But guys on the ends are kind of catching it, aren't we?
We'll mix it up more.
Anyway, just real quick, what happened, and it's already been touched on a little bit, is new licenses that came off the list after July 1 of 23 couldn't be sold or transferred. The thought there is that the speculators would have no legitimate reason to stay on those lists. And so people that truly wanted to be in the business and needed that for their business model could have the opportunity to be in that business and make that their livelihood if they wanted. Also, in recognition of the fact that some people spent $200,000-$300,000 for a license, and it would be kind of maybe unfair if the state created a problem not to be at least amenable to trying to help solve it or transition away from that speculative nature and that high value nature. So we allowed licenses that are in play now or in play before the July 1st of 23 to be sold or transferred once. And you say, well, they wouldn't be worth anything because the new owner wouldn't get any value out of it. But that's not true. If somebody's coming into town and they need that for their business model, they still can't buy one. They still can't get one because of the quota system. So that value will still be there. And in fact, it may even increase because as some of those are sold off, supply and demand would dictate there will be fewer available for sale. And so they could, I think the ability to retrieve value will still be there. And somebody said, well, I can only sell it once. Well, in the old days, before this legislation, you can only sell it once and then it's somebody else's. So that's kind of a misnomer. The other thing that happened in recognition of some exceptions need to be made, you know, if somebody wills it to a child or a next of kin or whatever, it's that one-time transfer sustains. If they give it without remuneration to some of their family members, then that also sustains. If there's other language in there, if they transfer it to another business that they own, those kind of things. And there's also some language in there that helps transition out of a lease environment. So there's a lot more detail than that, but I want the others to get a shot at it. So that's kind of what the license or what the legislation did. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Guthrie. Dave.
Yes. I think that I appreciate Senator Guthrie. I think last year we came into the session with a different bill, and Senator Guthrie wanted to get a number of people together to have a conversation about this. And that we had two meetings with Senator Guthrie with a fairly diverse stakeholder group that had a lot of different opinions. And out of that came a single idea that we all agreed was a pretty good idea, and that was new licenses. We should deal with new licenses in a way that begins to fix this problem, and that was to make them non-transferable. That led to Senate Bill 1120. Our group, FAIR, opposed Senate Bill 1120 ultimately because that bill also included changes to existing licenses and their ability to be transferred. And I think the problem with it was that we just didn't have enough time. I mean, this bill went from, an idea, a single idea, to a bill that was introduced in the Senate within about a 2-week window. And I was concerned, and I think it's played out as we look at existing licenses. It's complicated. The regulatory framework for existing licenses and how the ecosystem works in the real world is complicated. And so we're starting to face some of those repercussions now, and we probably need to go back and fix them. One of those, for example, is a lot of people who own property, developers in particular. If they own property, they want to make an investment in that property. They get a tenant. will go out and find a license for that tenant, and then they invest in that property to put that restaurant or that hotel in business. And if that tenant over time fails and they need to put somebody else in there, they can't recoup that investment if they can't have a license. And because of the way that 1120 was written, you can't lease licenses anymore, so they can't lease the license to that tenant. And you can't go out, and you might be able to find one for some period of time, but if licenses slowly become non-transferable, existing licenses, that inventory, as it depletes, it's going to be harder to find licenses. So I think there's a lot of concern about how that's going to work. So we probably need to find solutions for that. I think, Senate Bill 1120, it also took away the 75-year historic provision, which was poorly written. It was an area that we wanted to work on. I think there is real benefit to finding some incentives for businesses that have been around for a long period of time. And it's also a way to increase inventory to reward those businesses. But Senate Bill 1120 basically just took that special permit out. So we lost that ability as well. So in general, I think our opposition was that Senate Bill 1120 it started with a good idea. And I like the approach where we got a group of stakeholders together to talk about how we can fix this system. But I think we just rushed this bill into becoming law before it had really worked itself through. And in general, some of the biggest problems with the system it didn't address, and worse, it made some of them worse. So.
Thank you, Dave. Jeremy.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I just want to say it was more than 2 meetings. It felt like a lifetime of meetings to me. I don't know how many times I sat in that conference room and talked to folks. But, credit to Senator Guthrie, who does believe in a collaborative approach and bringing people together to discuss these. And definitely they're difficult issues. But I do want to pick up on something that Dave Krick said, which is, the perception of this problem, and I've been involved in it for 25 years or more now, but it always came down to those people who wanted to take a stick of dynamite, throw it into the middle of the quota system and just absolutely blow it up, which caused all kinds of problems for licensees and the values that they had in their licenses, versus the licensees who really didn't want to do anything. And so their answer was always, no, this is too fast and we need more time to study it. Watching this go on for the past 25 years, I can tell you that waiting was no longer an option for the legislature. Senator Guthrie mentioned it. His predecessor in the State Affairs Committee was Senator Patty Ann Lodge. She was hell-bent on reforming this. Senator Jim Rice also involved in it, but this issue keeps coming back and it keeps coming back. And I think the more it comes back, the less the legislature was willing to let it lie. Something was going to happen. And let me be quite clear, I was involved in killing these bills, and I was making a comfortable living killing these bills every year, but it became quite apparent it wasn't going to happen anymore. Something needed to be done. So really, from my client's perspective, and I represent license holders, and I represent the Idaho Beer and Wine Distributors Association. From our perspective, we wanted to do 2 things. One, protect the quota system because we think that is a responsible way to control the density of liquor outlets. And 2, do everything we could to protect the value that licensees had in their values. There's no such thing as a perfect piece of legislation. You could try all you might to get it 100% perfectly right. It's incredibly difficult to do. And with a topic such as this, I'm sure it's going to continue to be discussed. But I firmly believe that no, we need more time just wasn't going to work with this legislature anymore.
Thank you. Kevin, would you finish us up on this one?
Ooh, I could talk for a long time on this. I actually I think the reason I know Jeremy is going back to the task force the Governor Otter put together shortly after he got elected, and we wrote that omnibus bill. It was about 70 pages, and it was a hard-fought battle, and we came one vote shy of passing. And the reason it didn't pass is we got caught up in horse trading and animosity at the end of the session over funding for road improvement taxes and stuff. I can't remember the exact issue, but it was, I will always remember the governor called that group a group of leadership over in the House. We'd made it through the Senate and said, well, I'm going to screw you on this bill, but I would like your support on this. And when they walked in, people that are still in leadership looked at Pam Eaton and myself and did the thumbs down, and our vote failed by one. If that had passed, we would not be having this issue today, because it solved for me what is the biggest problem. When you come to Idaho and you want to get in the bar business, your question today has to be, can I get a license, right? And you can say, well, you can get beer and wine. Hard liquor is 20% of my profit. I do not have a business with just beer and wine. It's a totally different business. So the current question now is, can I get a license? And it's become more cloudy. And let me explain that. I think ultimately what we need is legislation that says, what kind of license do I want? Legacy license with its privileges, or a new issue license? And it does affect the quota system if you do something like that. But I think ultimately for healthy communities, you need a healthy, vibrant hospitality industry. And you're not going to do that with beer and wine only. So from that standpoint, then I look at how did this bill affect my businesses? Well, I purposely did not get involved in this legislation because I know I can be a hot point within the bar business in Boise. I got a lot of blowback when the Governor Little put me on his economic rebound task force coming out of COVID. And so I thought it was good to stay on the sidelines, but I kind of watched a little bit, and the Lodging and Restaurant Association watched a little bit. I don't know exactly how involved Pam got, but I think that our organization, the Idaho Lodging and Restaurant Association, could never really figure out how this would work. And we did have board members who felt, yes, I'll take anything that will kick a license loose at a price I'm willing to pay, because they live in that $300,000 community, resort community, and they don't want to pay that. So we kind of sat on the sidelines. So I looked at how does it affect my business? Well, I've got 4 licenses, 4 restaurants that are healthy. If they're going to get sold going forward, they're going to be sold with the real estate, with the license. And so they would stay eligible for the continuous sale. And that is a very big deal. As a employee-owned business now, we're held by a trust. It's a highly regulated trust. We have to go through an annual evaluation by a professional outside firm. It's a very expensive process. I called the evaluator up and said, how are you going to look at this coming forward? And we're lucky we're doing enough volume that they're not going to appraise our assets. They're going to use our revenue stream. But if we were a new entity coming in, and there's actually a restaurant opening up down the street who paid $300,000 for a liquor license before the bill hit the floor and has not even opened up yet. When he gets open, if he doesn't succeed, that's an extra $300,000 that he's lost. And that is a really high hurdle. If I have leveraged the liquor licenses that I have bought for loans to get my restaurants open. The ability to do that has been greatly impacted. So I look at it from that standpoint, but I also think that my licenses may be worth a little bit more. Where the conundrum is now, if we decided that the community was ready for a Bardenay and Caldwell, how's it really going to impact us? Because I'm not going to pay $200,000 in additional sunk cost, meaning I can't carry it forward. I can't recapture it down the road to speculate on a restaurant in Caldwell. And for that, part of the reason behind forming the trust is it is a great vehicle for growth. And we want this company to grow, because now going from 2 people who owned it, it now has 100 people with an ownership share in it. And we want to continue to enhance the value for their retirement programs. That's what the trust is all about. So what I kind of at the gist of this legislation is really about, you think that the sale of a liquor license is easy, right? You sell it, you don't sell it, you don't have a criminal background, you can have it. Well, my experience, when Bardenay Inc. had 4 LLCs underneath it, and those 4 LLCs are the 3 Bardenays and Coins, and that's where the liquor licenses sat. So I actually engaged an attorney for the first time ever to help me explain to Alcohol Beverage Control what was happening. The licenses ownership wasn't changing. The corporate that went from Lisa and myself being the sole owners to a single entity trust. ABC got this very detailed letter explaining what was happening, and they looked at, and all 4 of those are structured the same, and they looked at it and said, these are 3 different transactions. They deemed one a sale, one not a sale, the other one was a straight transfer, and they proved one right away. But they were all the exact same. They were trying to figure out when you sell a license, they take 10%. They were trying to make sure I wasn't just dodging the 10%. It was a nightmare. It took 2.5 to 3 months to get them to understand that. That's a simple transaction. So now this new legislation says sales should be easy. We should know when a sale occurs. No, you don't. And to highlight this, out of that putting me through the ringer, the one thing they got out of it is they went back and using my paperwork that I had getting them when I bought Dave out, they dug it back up and went, hey, you owe us $6,000 from a transaction 21 years ago. Same paperwork, they just reinterpreted. So a sale is not necessarily a sale. I think that's part of what makes this difficult. And one last piece, maybe I can get this question answered. Because up in Coeur d'Alene, if we were to decide that we wanted to relocate up there, don't like the landlord, whatever, can we relocate it, move that license over without losing the privilege of reselling that license down the road or the 5%? I can't tell from looking at the legislation. So those are my issues with it. I love the intent of getting people out of the leasing business. If I thought the leasing business was reasonable, I would have kept the 4 licenses and leased them to the trust. Could have easily done that. I think it's bad business, and I would never lease a license. So I'm glad we're getting that one piece fixed. Now can we figure out how to make licensing easier, I think, to understand.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and to all the panelists for that. As somebody who's not intimately involved in the liquor licensing space, there's certainly a lot I'm learning, but also lots of layers and lots of history. Jeremy, I didn't even realize 25 years you've been engaged in this space. So just a lot of context for our viewers and our listeners, in addition to what, industry stakeholders have been tracking this whole time. So many of you have kind of already alluded to this next question. I want to talk a little bit about, just like Jeremy said, there's no such thing as perfect legislation. And oftentimes these big issues, you kind of move a big package forward and you come back the next year and there's some fine tuning and reassessing and kind of seeing how things played out in the interim. I'm curious to know, what are some additional changes that folks kind of from all areas of this issue feel like are needed to improve liquor licensing regulations? So from a business owners and a distributor standpoint, what are you seeking in terms of additional improvements? And then are there any additional regulations that state lawmakers think you all didn't quite get to this year? So maybe I'll start with Dave and Kevin, who are in the restaurant business directly, and then we can jump to Jeremy and then Senator Guthrie, and kind of mixing it up a little bit this time. So Dave, can we get you to start on this one?
Sure, I'd love to. I think, I don't want to get into the mechanics of the quota system. I think I want to talk about fixes that we see as it relates to 1120 and ideas we have for how we move forward. I would say that the first thing that we need to do is continue what I think Senator Guthrie started last year, which is to have a working group that actually does represent, I think, some of the diverse interests in this topic, especially those that work in the industry who see it, I think, as what like listening to Kevin and hearing his story, it's a unique story in that there are so many of these unique stories around the state. When you sit and talk to restaurant owners and developers who work in this space, there's so many unique circumstances that I think the law has to be able to account for that. And right now, Senate Bill 1120 made it more complicated, not easier for people to operate in the space. So there's a handful of things that I think that are really practical that we have to do. One, in Senate Bill 1120, Section 15, in new licenses, making them non-transferable, it states that those licenses can't physically move. This is problematic. If you're going to get a new license off the system, let's say 10 years from now, you're in a lease negotiation. If your landlord knows that you can't physically move, they've got you. They can charge you whatever they want because you don't have any choice other than to renew at whatever their terms are. So I think operators have to be able to move their license to a different location. They have to have that ability to be able to negotiate in good faith and know that if they can't get the deal they want out of one landlord, they can go to a different landlord and find a different space for that particular thing without the threat that they're going to lose their license. The big one is transferability, I think, in existing licenses. So in working with existing licenses, I think most of us feel like we'd like to see Section 16 just taken back out and rethought completely differently. Because I think for people who are seeking a license, the ability to go out and buy a license or to lease a license, it makes sense. But when we've created these new rules that begin to restrict that, especially with existing licenses, I think it creates some unintended problems. So at a minimum, we should allow leases in the case where you have somebody who owns property who's leasing to a tenant in that space. They can also lease the license then to that tenant so that that license is attached to that property. This allows for the kind of economic development that is pretty typical in our industry, where a developer has a project, they want to put in a hotel or a restaurant in that project, and they need to be able to acquire a license for it. And the way that they make that work then is they lease that license to that tenant. That, at a minimum, should be something that we should have. I think, looking at leases, I think we would all agree there's a lot of people who own licenses that have no vested stake in the industry. They've just acquired them through one way or another. And then they lease those and make money on them. I think most of us would like to see that type of transaction go away, and this bill does solve that. But there does need to be a way for people who are getting started in the industry to start. My second license, my first license was with Kevin, and we bought that one. My second license was when Kevin and I opened Bardenay. I became my own biggest competitor, so I wanted to add liquor to Bitter Creek, so I had to lease a license because I couldn't afford to buy another one. That's pretty common. You talk to a lot of people, and their first license was leased, and that's how you break into the system and vet that and figure out if that works or not. So is there a way to do that it's not done through private interests? I don't know. And I think this is where getting stakeholders together to talk through the system and figure out, are there other ways to do this that would work better? I think those ideas are there. I'd add a big idea that I thought of late last year as we were going through this, as we talk about speculators in the system. One of the biggest problems with licenses is that new licenses that come off the list are basically issued at whatever the cost is to register that license, to pay your annual fees. And that's a huge discrepancy between the market value of those. And one of the implications of this bill, the state, last year, I think they collected about $800,000 in transfer fees. Well, they're going to lose a lot of that income because of this bill, because they don't collect as much of that transfer fee anymore because there won't be those transfers. And so they're looking at how they're going to increase rates to liquor license holders across the state. I'm like, why is the state issuing new licenses at basically for free? They should be issuing them at market value. When the state issues a new license, it shouldn't go out at less than what the market value is. And the state knows the market value because they assess these for transfer fees. So if all new licenses were issued at market value by the state would get that income from that, which would be significant. And I think you'd eliminate a lot of people who are on that list not because they want a license, but because they want to make money on having a license. Myself, I'm on the list for Boise. Why? Why wouldn't I be? As a restaurant owner, if we can get a license off the list, we can sell our existing license and put the license off of the list into our business. So it's good business. And when you look at those lists, in a lot of cases, along with speculators, many of the people on the lists are actually restaurant operators or bar operators, knowing that they are going to be able to take that free license and replace their own license and sell their own license on the market. So issuing those at market value, I think, makes it a little more honest, where at least there isn't that big discrepancy anymore. Lastly, I think, looking at how we bridge the gap, I think that there are some that want a lot more licenses in the market, and there are some that don't want to change the quota system because it works in a lot of our communities. We had proposed to rewrite the section about historic licenses, and part of this is like finding a win-win solution. I think if you're going to increase the number of licenses in a market by having those new licenses issued to businesses that have stood the test of time. So as we increase inventory, we provide licenses to those whose businesses have stood for 30, 50, 75 years, whatever that mark is. We give a historic business a license. It increases inventory. It puts the reward into the hands of the business that has stood that test of time, and slowly increases inventory in the system that over time would in effect have the same result of lowering the quota or changing how we issue license, and I think in a very simple way. But it's hard to wrap your brain around it, because it feels a little bit like, well, why are we rewarding people who already have liquor licenses? Well, because they've been invested in it for many years, and so they have the most to lose when we begin to increase that inventory. So I think those are some of the rough ideas. We know with 1120 there's some changes we need to make, and then I think we just need to be creative and pull together people who have ideas for how we might fix some of these other problems.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Kevin, is there something, additional context or ideas you'd like to add from a restaurant license holder perspective?
So, Dave's got he's obviously been giving this a lot of thought, has some good ideas. The thing of paying market rate, they do know what market rate is, because if you tell them you only paid $50,000 for a license in Boise, they're going to come back and go, nope, this is what we're going to assess your 10% on. And but you also have a lot of communities where their licenses are worth nothing. There are a lot of communities where 2 licenses per 1,500 is all they need. It's really communities like Boise, where you have a lot of people coming in, or resort communities like Ketchum, Coeur d'Alene, where it's really an issue. I mean, those are the biggest issues. So if people think every license in the state's worth $300,000, they're way wrong. And I think that's part of the issue with people that have licenses. And the bills we've worked on in the past, you've had people that really thought that was going to be their retirement fund. Well, I'm sorry, but your licenses in Emmett, it's really not worth $300,000 these days. Maybe it is now, but back then it wasn't. So there is this, trying to figure out where the real value is, I think is an interesting problem. And from my standpoint, I have never looked at the licenses as an investment. It goes on my balance sheet at the price I paid for it. It stays at that price to this day. And when my friends have come to me and said, should I buy a license? I'm like, unstable investment, I wouldn't touch it. So I don't think they're great you've got to be a high risk person. So back to how do we what would I like to see going forward? Part of the problem now is, and I've heard it said, well, just get on the list. Anybody know how long it takes to come up on the list right now? Do we know if it's going to accelerate? That list and the timeline in it, you have to do a FOIA request to actually get it. So if it was public, if it was easy to figure out, what the turn rate is, when people are coming off the list. I don't know how long you've been on the list, Dave, but I've been on the list in Eagle now for 7 years, right? I have no idea where I am, where I'm going to come up. I could, and I don't want to call up my attorney and say, would you make the request to find out where I sit today? Same thing. We put a request out to find out what licenses we're selling for. Recently, we got that, but we didn't get the other half of the information, I think, and it was really where we stood on another list. And so we do need to figure out how, if we're going to stick with a list, can we easily get there without actually having to go to change legislation? Maybe ABC could just put that information, make it a lot more accessible. And then, at the end of the day, I will always say we need to get rid of this question. The question needs to flip from, can I get it, to what kind of license do I want? I really liked, and Jeremy's going to tell me I'm just hung up on that bill. It died all those years ago. I should get over it. But if you give the people that have licenses some special privileges, which you do somewhat in this bill that just passed, but make them a little more explicit, and then allow other people to get a license, but it's a lot more expensive to operate under. I think that is a solution that could possibly work, but it is bringing everybody together. I really think that it needs to be. I've sat on task force put together by the legislature. I've been on task force trying to be driven by the Lodging and Restaurant Association. The most effective one was coming out of the governor's office. I think it really needs somebody who's a disinterested party to drive this show. I don't necessarily think the restaurant industry or the development community or anything can drive it, because you need somebody that can really get people's attention and get all parties at the table. When we did it, you need cities and counties, you need the sheriff's department, we had alcohol beverage control, we had everybody, we had Senate, House, and I think that's what it's going to take to kind of ease this up. And it would have been nice if ABC, I think, was comfortable using the legislation as it passed and write out a better set of rules and how they're going to interpret what a sale is, stuff like that, so that there's clarity. I shouldn't be asking if I want to move to a different building, what's going to happen.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Jeremy, your turn.
Yeah, well, since Kevin opened the door, I'm going to tell him that, Kevin, that bill is dead and it's not coming back. But again, you opened the door for it, so I'm just walking through it. I also think it's important to remember that it was liquor licensees themselves that killed that bill. And when they killed that bill, the reason was it's too drastic of a change and we need more time to study it. So, I mean, that's kind of the set of circumstances that got you to where we are today. You asked the question, Kathy, what's in this for my clients? What do we want to get out of it? Again, I represent both the Beer and Wine Distributors Association and I represent a liquor licensee. We were perfectly fine with the status quo. Our goals were to keep the quota system and do as little damage to licensees as possible and try to protect their value. So I don't know that there is some big overarching goal that we have, but I get asked to participate in these meetings. And as long as people like Chairman Guthrie or Chairman Crane are asking us to be, good faith participants in the process, we're always going to be good faith participants. I will tell you that amongst both of the clients that I represent, there is sympathy for resort cities. It is a strange phenomenon. And I'll tell you, just a couple of weeks ago, I went into McCall and I think the population sign said something like 3,800. And I just absolutely laughed. There's more than 3,800 people in the cove hanging out near the boat that I was at. There's just, when you get that massive influx of people, it makes sense to try and figure out something for them. I have spoken with the resort cities. I've given them some ideas on what I think they could do that wouldn't upend the entire system, but at the same time provide them a safety valve. To me, it's always been a little bit interesting that here you have this state-issued license that has become such a commodity, and the games that are played with it. I can't think of another instance in state licensing or permitting that has this problem. I mean, we don't see it with fish and game licenses. We don't see it with other types of licenses that are also scarce and limited. That's what makes it such a unique problem. But certainly my clients have a lot of sympathy for people who are earnestly in the business, trying to make a living, and are caught up in a system of games that frankly the state laws have set up. I guess if I was going to boil it down to what we're interested in, is just reasonable regulation. These are our industry partners at all times, and we want to be good industry partners.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. And Senator Guthrie, to wrap up the question, if there's anything the legislature, you or your colleagues might be looking at for 2024.
I know we're about out of time, so real quick, I just want to fill in a couple of things. It was commented about this could limit the number of licenses. This is not going to change the number of licenses. There's going to be the same number of licenses available after 11/20 than there was before. And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned, specifically on these leases, you've got somebody that doesn't want to be in the business, but yet they got this license, and they're getting up to $60,000 a year for lease payments. How is that right? And that's why we looked at the lease component. There's no other license. You can't lease your barber's license or your business license for that kind of money. So I think that was important that we looked at that. Every year there's 300 to 400 bills that are passed, and most of them are tweaks to existing legislation. And I say that because I'm reasonable. If there's some ideas that come forward and we need to make some tweaks, that's fine. I'm probably not interested in gutting Section 16. If we need to make some tweaks to that, I'm reasonable. Let's look at it. I'm sure we didn't get things perfect, but I will tell you, we're 52 days into this bill taking effect, and you'd think the entire sky was falling. We don't even know what the effects are going to be yet. So I would just encourage a little bit of let's take a breath. Let's have a reasonable, using the theme of the format here is civility, and let's talk about it, and we'll see what we need to maybe look at next year. Now, as far as doing market value from the Department from ABC, how is a young guy going to get into the business paying $250,000 to get started? You can't do that. So you've taken away somebody that just wants to be in the business, just starting out. I think that kind of wraps up what I want to say. There's a lot more that could be said, and I think we all feel the same way. But I hope that I've been threatened. You wouldn't believe some of the things that people have expressed to me, and clear filled with hate. But let's see what happens and see where maybe some changes make sense, and let's continue to talk about it. I do think resort cities are an area that needs to be looked at. I think we need to look at whether or not we need to keep doing more of these special licenses or not. Let's face it, that's why they have come into play. We see them every year. We've seen 2 or 3 this year, and that's because there's anomalies out there. There's unique situations where there is a demand that's beyond what the current system provides for. So thank you again for having us.
Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation and discussion over this very enormous topic. And so just to close out, I'm going to combine our last 2 questions that we had shared with you, panelists. We know that this can be one of the most contentious topics that happens in the State House. And so just quickly, in the last few minutes that we have, what do you feel is needed to keep the conversation moving forward? I like the fact that we've already talked about collaboration and recognize that Senator Guthrie is big on that and will include those that need to be. And I think that's a key component. But what are some other things that we can do to keep this conversation moving forward in a civil dialogue? And along with that, if you want to, what would be your ideal beverage to enjoy while you actually negotiate these future liquor licensing reforms and or policy changes? Let's start with, I thought I dropped. Let's start with Jeremy Pisca, and then go to Senator Guthrie, and then we will move to Kevin and to Dave to close us out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're listening to this conversation, you've heard 4 different points of view on something that is immensely complicated. It's got layers, it's got real financial implications to people. It's in this issue in particular, more than I've seen in others in recent history, there are a lot of, I mean, there was a lot of villainization of anybody who was involved in it. I think that's got to end. I think everybody has to realize that we're all in this soup together, and we should, to the greatest extent possible, hear each other out and keep striving towards something that is a good middle ground. I just think it's too complicated and it has way too many financial and personal implications for people. And at all times, we do well to respect that. What kind of a beverage do I want while we're negotiating this? I'm going to cop out and say it depends on the time of year. It depends on the time of day. It depends on the temperature outside, and it depends on what I'm going to be doing the rest of the day.
Oh, my word. Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Senator Guthrie.
Yeah, that was a cop out, Jeremy. Well, probably milk. Guy would probably need milk to set at the table for this topic to be discussed. But no, I just appreciate this opportunity, and I do think we still need to continue the conversation. And I hope that I've made it clear that I'm willing to participate in those discussions. So thank you again.
Wonderful. Thanks, Senator Guthrie. Kevin.
Well, I mean, conversations, you can't fix things you don't talk about, right? So I think that is the key. I think during the actual hashing through the details, water should be the drink of choice. But I think the ideal thing is the night before, getting together for a cocktail and convivial conversation that could touch lightly on liquor issues, but just really help to let people get to know each other better. And I'm going for a gin martini.
Wonderful. I love it. All right, Dave, wrap us up.
All 4 of us. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I would say, all 4 of us have suffered some of this villainization on this particular topic. And I think it's frustrating because I adore all 3 of these other panelists here. I think that they're very smart and people with great integrity. And so I think that, the biggest challenge is we're all busy. And I think too often you get into a session and elected officials are busy and we're busy. And so we don't communicate. We don't find time to get to know each other and talk to each other. So I think making time to make sure that we've got the right people in the conversation and that we're listening broadly to other people. I think for me, getting out and talking to restaurant operators in other parts of the state has been very useful, especially listening to people who I don't agree with, who have different opinions from me, and trying to understand their perspective, going over to Victor and Driggs and visiting with Mayor August and with some of the restaurateurs over there and seeing the challenges that they have. I think it's impactful, and it helps to be able to personalize it and to I think, force you to be creative. And so I think there's a lot of creative ideas. And I think the more we can figure out how to work together in a collaborative way and trust each other to be creative, we'll find some success with this.
Thanks, Dave. Did you have a drink you wanted to share with us right before we say goodbye?
Well, for me, of course, it's going to be a good beer.
Yeah. Very nice. Well, thank you so much. I know that this has been a difficult conversation, likely more conversations to be had as we move forward. But just a big thank you to each of you for agreeing to come and be on today's panel and having the conversation amongst yourselves as well as with our audience that's following along online. So again, a big thank you to Senator Jim Guthrie, Dave Krick, Jeremy Pisca, and Kevin Zettles for joining us for today's conversation. And a big thank you to all of you who tuned in to watch as well. As always, we'd like to thank the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber along with our media partners, Idaho Education News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press Club, and the Idaho Capital Sun. And of course, our incredible presenting sponsor, Holly Troxel. And then please join us again next month during your lunch hour on September 18th for a great discussion. This time, another contentious but super important topic around ongoing property tax reform. We'll have a special guest host next week. Quinn Perry from School Boards Association will be joining in my absence. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your Monday.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.